By the time I opened the door, chaos had already taken over my driveway. Officers in suits, cars lined up like a blockade, and a woman in pink pointing fingers and shouting orders. They said I had no rights, that my land didn't belong to me. But as I stood there, staring at what was once my peaceful home, I knew one thing. They had underestimated me, and that mistake would cost them. Nathan Cole had been gone from Ashwood Valley for 9 long years. Long enough for the dust to settle on memories he didn't want to unpack, and long enough for old enemies to forget his face. Or at least he hoped they had. The road felt narrower than he remembered, carved through a maze of pine trees and abandoned barns. The kind of scenery that made a man think every shadow was watching him. He'd spent the last decade crushing corrupt HOAs across the country, taking down board presidents who treated homeowners like tenants under a medieval empire. But none of the battles he fought compared to the lawsuits, threats, and land feuds he'd grown up around in this valley. Before we get started, I've got a quick question for you. Tell us which beautiful country you tuned in from and what time it is. I'd love to know. Alright, so here's how this circus started. He had expected quiet. He expected peace. He expected to pull up to his father's old 600-acre ranch and feel the kind of calm they promised in therapy podcasts he never listened to twice. Instead, he saw flashing blue lights bouncing off his front gate before he even reached it. 2 squad cars blocked the driveway, a tow truck idled nearby, and a group of people stood around as if they were waiting for a show to start. It wasn't the welcome home he imagined, but it was exactly the kind he should have expected. At the center of it all stood a woman in a neon yellow blazer, the kind only HOA presidents and real estate tyrants wore as a form of psychological warfare. Her hair was stiff enough to survive a hurricane, and she held a clipboard thicker than a Bible. Even without hearing her voice, he could tell she was the type who weaponized rules for sport. This valley had many predators, but she looked like the apex. Nathan didn't step out of the truck right away. He watched first. He always watched first. That habit had saved him more times than body armor ever could. The tow truck driver kept shaking his head, pointing at papers, likely trying to explain something the woman refused to understand. The officers looked bored. Not neutral, not detached, just bored, like they were used to responding to this circus and no longer cared who the clown was. He finally stepped out, boots crunching on gravel, instantly drawing the woman's attention. She stared at him like he'd walked into the wrong movie. She hadn't expected him. She expected the ranch to be empty, vulnerable, ripe for whatever operation she had planned. He saw the calculation flicker in her eyes. Fear, recognition, and something that looked dangerously close to frustration. He didn't know her name yet, but he already knew her type. Someone who believed authority was inherited, not earned. Someone who hid behind laws she misquoted. Someone who expected the world to bend because she never learned how to function when it didn't. A gust of dry Texas wind cut across the yard, carrying the familiar smell of cedar, dust, and old barns. The scent of home he'd long tried to bury. But there was something else, something metallic and stale, the smell of paperwork done behind closed doors. The smell of trouble. From the looks of it, she wasn't here for a friendly neighborhood welcome. She was here to see something, the gate, the house, the land, or maybe the whole damn ranch. Nathan's name was still legally tied to every acre, yet these people had arrived with the full confidence of someone acting under a signed order. An order he knew he hadn't received. That was the moment he realized this wasn't random. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't even about some petty HOA violation he could laugh off. This was targeted, calculated, timed. Someone knew he was coming back. Someone who wanted him out before he set foot inside the house. Someone who believed he wouldn't fight back. Someone who assumed Nathan Cole had gone soft after years away from his hometown. He looked past the crowd at the ranch itself. The old barn stood crooked but stubborn, still painted the same faded red his father insisted on keeping. The fields stretched wide, overgrown but familiar. His childhood echo lived in every fence post, every worn-out trail, every ridge outlined against the sky. This land wasn't just dirt. It was proof of everything his family had endured: droughts, bad seasons, lawsuits, rumors, and the kind of small-town politics that ruined reputations before facts could catch up. He hadn't returned to reclaim memories. He came back because the land was the last piece of his father he had left. And now someone was trying to take it. The neon blazer woman pointed toward the ranch house with a kind of triumph on her face, the expression of someone who thought she'd won something he didn't even know was up for grabs. The officers shifted awkwardly. The tow truck continued to idle, waiting for permission to carry out an order that made no sense. Nathan scanned the fence line. The signs had changed. Someone had posted new HOA boundaries that had never existed when his father ran the land. A metal sign bolted near the mailbox read, Ashwood Meadows Residential Community. Even though this was ranch country, not suburbia, there were no sidewalks, no manicured lawns, no planned homes, nothing that resembled a residential community at all. Yet there it was, a boundary sign claiming the valley had been absorbed by an HOA nobody asked for. That was the first real clue. Somebody had expanded an HOA illegally, probably through falsified maps or backdoor meetings, and his land was the biggest target on the board. It meant money, control, power, and the woman in the neon blazer wasn't just enforcing rules. She was orchestrating a takeover. Nathan felt something old stir in his chest. Not anger, not fear, but the cold clarity he'd honed after taking down hundreds of corrupt HOAs across the country. This wasn't just a personal attack. It wasn't even about him. This was about an organized, systematic grab. The kind he'd seen in Arizona, Nevada, Florida. Most HOAs he dismantled eventually revealed the same pattern. Greed dressed up as governance. But this time it was on his land. His family's name. His father's legacy. He stepped forward, resolving nothing out loud. Because he didn't need to. The moment he crossed the property line, everything shifted. The air, the tension, the stakes. Nathan Cole was home. And whoever thought they could take this ranch was about to learn why entire states had tried and failed to break him. The board met every first Saturday of the month, always at the same place. The HOA's Community Operations Center, which was really just an over-renovated barn with a fresh coat of paint and a sign that made it sound like a military outpost. Nathan had seen enemy war rooms with less paranoia, cameras in every corner, laminated bylaws pasted like religious scripture, and a long polished table where 6 people sat like they were running the Pentagon instead of a neighborhood with a population smaller than a Chick-fil-A lunch rush. He didn't walk in like a neighbor. He walked in like a man who knew exactly how deep corruption could hide in a room like that. But he said nothing at first. Silence always made people reveal their worst truths. And here they did. Immediately. Margaret Williams wasn't there yet. Power always arrived late. But her board, her loyal little circle of overcompensating retirees, looked like they had been waiting to attack someone who wasn't even here yet. No one looked at Nathan directly, but everyone kept glancing at his folder like it contained the nuclear codes. In a way, it did. Inside was the stack of documents he'd pulled from the county office the night before. Zoning requests, forged signatures, altered maps, all leading to one outcome. Margaret's plan to absorb his family's land into the HOA's jurisdiction. The scam wasn't new. He'd dismantled versions of this across 3 states. But seeing it in Willowbrook, on the land he grew up on, tasted different. More humiliating. More personal. Like someone had broken into his childhood home, not to steal but to rearrange everything until it no longer felt like his. The board was nervous. He didn't need training to see that. Hyper-sweaty palms. Fake smiles. The way they leafed through papers that had nothing written on them, just to look busy. Every one of them was afraid, but not of being guilty. They weren't smart enough to run this level of scheme. They were afraid of disappointing Margaret. It wasn't loyalty. It was cult leadership disguised as community service. When Margaret finally walked in, she didn't greet anyone. She didn't even acknowledge Nathan. She moved like she owned oxygen and everyone else was leasing it from her. A bright scarf, a clipboard hugged to her chest like a weapon, and a walk that said she believed she could win every fight by simply declaring herself correct before the argument even began. She sat. Everyone else straightened like soldiers. Nathan didn't. She noticed. "Mr. Hayes," she said, using that tone HOA presidents use when they're about to say something illegal with confidence. "You are here today because of an incident you caused yesterday." He didn't respond. Not yet. She opened a folder as dramatically as if she expected theme music to play behind her. "You obstructed a certified HOA inspection, verbally assaulted an enforcement officer, and interfered with official operations." It was almost impressive how many lies she managed to stack in one sentence without choking. Nathan leaned back, still silent. Margaret continued, "You will receive a $2,300 violation for non-compliance. Additionally, your fence." "My fence?" he finally said, not lifting his voice, not leaning forward, but stopping her cold. Margaret froze. Not visibly, but he saw it. The flicker. The millisecond pause of someone who did not expect to be interrupted by a man who didn't fear her carefully curated authority. Yes, she said, recovering. Your fence is encroaching on HOA-managed green space. That fence was built in 1968, he said. By my grandfather. Before this HOA existed. Before most of you lived here. It doesn't matter, she replied too quickly. The HOA has retroactive authority over all land within our expansion zone. There it was. Expansion zone. The very phrase from the forged documents. Nathan placed his own folder on the table. The sound echoed. Not loud, but heavy. Like the quiet thump of a gavel. Margaret blinked. What is that? You tell me, he said calmly. She didn't reach for it. She didn't need to. The panic in her eyes told him she already knew exactly what was inside. A board member, Tom, the twitchy one who looked like he did crime by accident, leaned forward to peek. He read the first page and went pale. Then the second page. Then the map. The sweat on his brow doubled. I didn't sign this, he muttered. You didn't, Nathan said. But someone did. For you. Margaret shot him a warning look, the universal signal for shut up if you want to keep your pension. He shrank in his seat. The room tightened like a fist. Nathan continued. Interesting thing about forgery. County records timestamp everything. Even the edits someone tries to hide. Margaret tried to cut him off. Mr. Hayes, you are out of order. No, he replied. I'm exactly in order. You're the one rearranging lines on maps that aren't yours. The board didn't breathe. Even the AC vent seemed scared. Margaret smirked, trying to regain footing. The HOA is well within its rights to expand community boundaries. Our members voted. 27 votes. Nathan corrected. Out of a required 63. Recorded on a day when 22 homes reported power outages. Conveniently, a few board members looked at each other. That was new to them. Margaret hadn't told them everything. She never did. He pushed the folder toward the center of the table. And this, he said, is your personal signature on a zoning request. Except the county clerk recorded your phone's location that day. You weren't at the office, or in the city, or even in the state. A full minute of silence passed. Tom's leg shook under the table. Linda, the treasurer, looked like she might confess out of guilt even if she had nothing to do with it. Ed, the vice president, stared at the ceiling like asking God to reverse time by 5 minutes. Margaret finally exhaled and leaned forward. Mr. Hayes, you are intimidating this board. No, he said. I'm informing it. There's a difference. She stood. This meeting is adjourned. It isn't, he said. She froze. Because adjournment requires a majority vote. The board members looked at him, then at her. Fear was shifting, realigning. Not toward him, but away from her. Nathan tapped the folder once. You have one chance to walk away clean. Tell your board the truth. All of it. Because the county, the state, and the people I work with are already looking at your paperwork. Margaret stared at him like she was deciding whether to scream, cry, or lunge across the table. Instead, she said nothing and stormed out. The door slamming so hard the Community Operations Center sign rattled. The board stayed frozen in their chairs, trapped between loyalty and survival. Nathan didn't wait for them to choose. He picked up his folder and walked out without another word. He knew exactly what Margaret would do next. And that was the real problem. She wouldn't back down. She would escalate. And tonight she would make her next move. A move that wouldn't just target his land, but his family name. Night fell over Willowbrook like a velvet curtain, soft but heavy, hiding things you didn't want to see until they were already on top of you. Nathan drove home slowly, the headlights cutting swaths through the quiet streets, but his mind wasn't on the road. It was on Margaret, on her fury, on the kind of person who, when cornered, doesn't retreat, they strike. By the time he pulled into the driveway, the place looked wrong. The kind of wrong that hits your stomach before your eyes. The fence, his grandfather's fence, was splintered in two. Not cut neatly, not with care. Destroyed. Chunks of wood scattered across the lawn like someone had thrown a tantrum with power tools. And worse, the gate hung off its hinges. Someone had been inside his property while he was away. Someone had trespassed. Someone had crossed the line. He didn't yell. He didn't run. He stepped out, boots crunching over wood shards, and immediately noticed the other signs. Footprints in the soil, fresh, muddy, deliberate. Tire tracks pressed into the grass, too wide for a neighbor's SUV. And something else. A small, white envelope tucked under the splintered remains of the gate. He picked it up. The handwriting was familiar, tight, almost obsessive, like someone who liked control too much. It read, "We warned you, Nathan. This is your last chance. The HOA doesn't forgive. It doesn't negotiate. It enforces. MW. No signature needed." He didn't need one. Margaret had written it herself. Inside the envelope, another paper. A crudely drawn map marking several points on his property. Symbols, notes, times. A threat, clear and methodical. This wasn't about property lines. This was about fear, about power, about dominance. Nathan's jaw tightened. He didn't panic. Not yet. But he knew two things instantly. She had stepped into territory where the law couldn't protect her without proof, and she was escalating. This wasn't just a war over land anymore, it was psychological. He walked around the yard, surveying the damage. The fencing wasn't just broken. It was symbolic. His family's legacy, shattered, literally at his feet. And worse, someone had tried to burn a small section of the lawn near the old oak tree. Fortunately, the ground was damp enough to stop a fire, but the intent was clear. Inside, he checked the security system. Cameras had been disabled, wires cut, lenses smeared. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Whoever did this was organized. Whoever did this had insider knowledge. He made one call. Not to the police, not yet. Not to anyone who could tip off the wrong people. One call to someone who knew how to track patterns like this, who knew how to handle threats that weren't ordinary. Within an hour, a vehicle pulled into his driveway. Two men, plain clothes, eyes that missed nothing. They surveyed the property with Nathan, silent but thorough. "This wasn't random," one of them said quietly. "This was calculated. Look at the timing. Look at the tools. Look at the access points. Someone had keys, schedules, and a plan." Nathan nodded. He already knew. It was her. Margaret. She had orchestrated this. The board members were pawns, but Margaret. She was the queen. And queens play differently when threatened. "Next time," the other agent added, "they won't leave a note. And it won't just be a fence." Nathan clenched his fists. He didn't flinch. Threats, intimidation, sabotage, they had a rhythm. He had seen them all before. He knew the rules. And he had a plan. By midnight, Nathan had reconstructed the scene, collected evidence, and recorded everything on encrypted drives. He knew Margaret would strike again. The question wasn't if, but when. And he wanted to be ready. The wind rustled the old oak leaves, whispering across the yard. Somewhere, the night birds had gone silent. Even nature seemed to hold its breath. He wasn't afraid, but he was angry, and anger, he knew, could be a weapon. Across town, in her high-rise corner office adorned with awards for community leadership, Margaret sat behind her desk, staring at a photo of Nathan's property on her tablet. She smiled, a slow, deliberate, satisfied smile. "He thinks he can play my game," she whispered to no one. "Let's show him what the HOA really is." Her fingers tapped out orders. Board members received vague but chilling messages. Contractors were instructed to handle certain issues discreetly. Legal counsel was briefed on ways to manipulate hearings in her favor. Every move she made was layered, precise, and relentless. Nathan didn't know yet, but soon, very soon, he would see her next play. And it would test not just his resolve, but the very foundation of his family's legacy. That night, Willowbrook slept uneasily, because the war had officially begun. And nobody, not Nathan, not Margaret, not the unsuspecting board members, would ever be the same again. The next morning, Willowbrook's sun rose over manicured lawns and quiet streets, but Nathan didn't see it. He was in the study, laptops open, folders spread across the desk like an evidence war map. Every photo, every footprint, every tire track, every broken splinter was cataloged. He had made notes on the sequence of events, timing, and possible motives. By mid-morning, the first legal notice arrived. It was disguised as routine HOA paperwork. A fine, a citation, something about unauthorized construction and non-compliance with community guidelines. But the real threat wasn't the money, it was the language. legalese wrapped around intimidation, designed to wear him down. Nathan didn't respond. Not yet. He read the notice again, line by line, highlighting key phrases. Failure to comply will result in escalation. Escalation. That word hit him like a hammer. Margaret's fingerprints were everywhere, but she wasn't dumb enough to be overt. The HOA board, under her control, sent this as a proxy. It was the first strike. The first legal blow in a war disguised as bureaucracy. He took a breath, then made a call. "Listen carefully," he said into the phone, voice calm but cold. "They've made their first move. I need full records, emails, meeting notes, voting logs, anything that ties Margaret to these actions. And I need it yesterday." By noon, the first set of documents arrived. Emails between board members, vague discussions about handling Nathan property issues, references to certain dates and the upcoming inspection. Nothing explicit, nothing that screamed illegal. But patterns never lie. Nathan's mind raced. He plotted his counter. The first strike would be legal. The strategy was simple. Turn the table without exposing himself. Every document he collected, every email, every tiny error in their process would be weaponized. Margaret had played dirty, thinking fear was her shield. Nathan planned to show her that fear had many faces. He wasn't one of them. By late afternoon, Nathan's lawyer arrived. A sharp, meticulous woman named Evelyn. She examined the HOA notice, Nathan's evidence, and the emails with a critical eye. "This isn't about fines," she said. "It's about power, and they're used to people backing down. But you're not like them. We'll draft a formal response that not only challenges the citation but puts the board and Margaret on notice. Procedural errors, conflicts of interest, failure to disclose meetings. All of it. We hit them where it hurts." Nathan nodded. He could see it already, the dominoes. The first legal strike wasn't meant to destroy. It was meant to set the tone, to establish that he wouldn't play by their rules, they would play by his. By evening, the response was ready. A concise, firm letter citing violations of HOA regulations, documented discrepancies, and demanding formal mediation. Copies were sent to every board member, with strict instructions to preserve all records. Meanwhile, Margaret was already in her office, scanning her emails. The response hit her like a slap. She read the letter twice, then again. Her expression, usually controlled and commanding, flickered. Nathan had pushed back. Boldly, precisely, effectively. She didn't speak aloud. She didn't have to. Her assistants sensed the tension in the room, the kind that comes before a storm. Margaret leaned back, tapping her fingers against the polished mahogany. "You're going to regret this," she murmured. But unlike before, there was caution now. She wasn't just sending threats. This was more complex. The game had changed. Nathan didn't sleep that night. He reviewed his evidence again, prepared notes for potential board meetings, and mapped out contingencies. Every move Margaret could make, every loophole she might exploit, he anticipated. He wasn't paranoid. He was prepared. By the next morning, a subtle shift had occurred in Willowbrook. The neighbors noticed tension during casual walks. Conversations at local coffee shops carried an edge when Nathan's property came up. Margaret's influence, once untouchable, was starting to be questioned quietly. Nathan knew the path ahead wouldn't be clean. There would be more threats, more sabotage attempts, more legal entanglements. But he had the first legal strike under his belt. And that strike, sharp and precise, had announced one undeniable truth. Nathan was no longer a passive player. Across town, Margaret convened an emergency board meeting. Her plan was to regain control, to intimidate him further, to exploit weaknesses, but even she knew something had shifted. Nathan wasn't cowering. And in her world, when someone doesn't cower, it's dangerous. The first legal strike wasn't just a letter. It was a message. And in the quiet of his study, Nathan allowed himself the smallest smile. The war was just beginning, but for the first time he felt like he had the upper hand. The morning after the first legal strike, Willowbrook seemed calm, almost serene. But calm in Willowbrook was always deceptive. Behind the neatly trimmed hedges and the echoing laughter of children in cul-de-sacs, currents of tension flowed like an underground river, invisible yet powerful. Nathan could feel it. Emails arrived first, from lawyers, board members, and even some neighbors whose loyalty was questionable. The tone was different now, less aggressive, more calculating. Margaret had learned something. Nathan was not someone to be bullied. But she was far from defeated. She was a strategist, patient and ruthless. She didn't counterattack immediately. Instead, she plotted, gathering intelligence, assessing weaknesses, and laying the groundwork for a response far more sophisticated than the first legal strike. Nathan, meanwhile, was preparing for the inevitable. He spent hours reviewing documents, cross-referencing HOA bylaws with municipal codes, and mapping out potential loopholes Margaret might exploit. His dining table had become a war room, filled with spreadsheets, diagrams, and color-coded timelines. Each piece of information was a piece of armor, each note a shield against the coming storm. By mid-morning, subtle signs began to emerge. Notices posted on the community bulletin board cited minor violations on Nathan's property. Trimmed hedges slightly over the permitted height, a mailbox that didn't align perfectly with HOA standards, and noise complaints that, upon inspection, seemed fabricated. Nathan read them carefully. He didn't panic. Each violation was minor, almost trivial, but the timing was precise. He knew Margaret's pattern. Overwhelm, intimidate, and create doubt in the neighbors' minds. He called Evelyn, his lawyer, to discuss the new notices. "They're testing you," she said after reviewing the documents. "It's a soft probe. They want to see how you react, whether you'll overcommit or show weakness. Don't. Document everything. Challenge every minor infraction. Build a record. They'll overreach eventually, and when they do, you'll have them." Nathan nodded. Patience was a weapon he wielded like a blade. By noon, he received another unexpected message. This time from a neighbor, someone he barely knew. The email was vague but urgent. "Be careful. Margaret isn't playing fair. She's willing to bend rules and maybe break them. Watch your back." Nathan didn't reply. Instead, he noted the source, the timing, and the possible motives behind the warning. It was another layer of the storm gathering around him. Over the next few days, subtle sabotage attempts began to surface. Tools went missing from Nathan's garage. Garden hoses were mysteriously cut. A sprinkler system malfunctioned at the worst possible moment, flooding part of his lawn. Each incident alone was inconclusive, but together, they painted a clear pattern. Margaret was testing the limits. She wanted Nathan to react emotionally, to make a misstep that could be used against him. But Nathan remained calm, methodical. He installed discreet security cameras, kept detailed logs of every incident, and even consulted a private investigator. Every misstep, every irregularity, was another piece of ammunition. Meanwhile, the HOA board meeting was scheduled. Margaret knew it was time to escalate. She summoned members to the conference room, her presence commanding attention. Her goal: portray Nathan as a troublesome neighbor, someone who disrupted the peace of Willowbrook. But Nathan wasn't unprepared. He arrived early, armed with evidence. Photos, emails, documented complaints, and legal citations. Every potential accusation Margaret might raise was countered with meticulous proof of her overreach and violations of procedure. As the meeting began, tension crackled in the air. Margaret opened with a rehearsed statement about community standards and neighborhood harmony. Nathan listened silently, then calmly presented his documentation. The room shifted. Board members who had always nodded along with Margaret's authority now exchanged uneasy glances. For the first time, doubt crept into Margaret's fortress of control. Her voice faltered, her usual confidence shaken. Nathan remained composed, unwavering. His strategy was simple: not to attack, but to expose. Not to confront directly, but to illuminate the inconsistencies and abuses hidden beneath the HOA's polished exterior. By the end of the meeting, the board was in disarray. Margaret's narrative had fractured, her control weakened. Nathan left the room with a quiet satisfaction. The first legal strike had been a warning. This was the storm manifesting, and it was gathering force. Outside, neighbors whispered. Some congratulated Nathan discreetly, others watched with curiosity or suspicion. The dynamics of Willowbrook were shifting. Fear, once a tool wielded by Margaret, was now reciprocal. People sensed that Nathan was a force, someone who would not be intimidated. Back at home, Nathan reviewed the footage from the security cameras. He caught a glimpse of one of Margaret's allies tampering with his sprinkler system. He documented it. Every piece of evidence reinforced a pattern. Every small act of sabotage became a building block for his eventual exposure of the entire scheme. That night, Nathan sat in his study, staring at the data, the emails, the footage. He realized that the gathering storm wasn't just about the HOA. It was about principles, about standing up against abuse of power, about turning fear into leverage. Margaret, on the other hand, paced in her office, frustrated and calculating. She had underestimated Nathan. Her first strike had failed to intimidate, and now the storm was growing beyond her control. She knew she needed a new strategy, something bigger, something that would catch Nathan off guard. But Nathan had one advantage: foresight. He anticipated moves before they were made. He mapped out contingencies, countermeasures, and fallback plans. Every challenge Margaret would throw at him, he would be ready. The storm was coming. It would not be gentle. But Nathan was no longer a passive target. He was the eye of the storm, calm and resolute, while chaos swirled around him. And in the quiet moments before sleep, he allowed himself one thought. This battle would not just be won in courtrooms or meetings. It would be won in patience, strategy, and the unshakable resolve to never back down. The war for Willowbrook had escalated. The first strike had been a message. The gathering storm was proof. Nathan was here to stay, and Margaret would soon learn that some storms cannot be controlled. They can only be endured or survived. The days that followed were a quiet crescendo, each passing hour adding weight to the tension in Willowbrook. Nathan noticed it in small things. Neighbors who used to nod politely now gave subtle, assessing glances. Conversations hushed when he approached. Subtle barriers erected around his property. Fences, cameras, and even a few friendly smiles that felt like veiled warnings. The HOA had drawn its battle lines, and Nathan was standing firmly in the center. Margaret, unrelenting, escalated with a precision that could only come from experience. Letters arrived at Nathan's door almost daily, citing ever more absurd violations. Hedges too tall by fractions of an inch, garden ornaments allegedly outside of compliance, and noise complaints at times when the only sound was Nathan's own breathing. But the most disturbing were the threats, thinly veiled warnings, hints that the community would take action if Nathan didn't comply. He kept calm. Each letter was scanned, cataloged, and photographed. Emails were printed and stored. Every minor detail became part of a dossier, a map of the HOA's increasingly aggressive tactics. Nathan had learned early that documentation was power. In the courts, in the boardroom, and in the court of public opinion, evidence was the ultimate weapon. Then came the first overt act of sabotage. It was subtle but unmistakable. The tires on Nathan's car were slashed. The pattern was deliberate, calculated, and unmistakable message. He examined the damage in silence, taking photographs, noting the time, and cross-referencing it with his security footage. There, in the corner of the driveway, a shadow lingered, a figure retreating hastily, clearly aware of the cameras. Nathan did not panic. He contacted the local authorities and filed a report, careful to frame it as a criminal act rather than a neighborhood squabble. The police promised an investigation, but Nathan knew the odds of catching the culprit were slim. Still, the act itself was significant. The HOA had crossed a line. Margaret's moves were escalating not just against him, but psychologically. The community, once a neutral audience, was subtly manipulated. Rumors circulated. Nathan was difficult, disruptive, unwilling to cooperate. Whispers in the grocery store, notes left in mailboxes, small gatherings where neighbors were reminded of proper protocol and community standards. Every word, every glance was carefully curated to isolate him. Nathan responded with strategy. He held meetings with key neighbors, casual yet purposeful conversations that built subtle alliances. He didn't confront directly. Instead, he asked questions, listened to concerns, and offered clarity. Slowly, the narrative began to shift. People noticed that the minor violations were trivial, that Nathan's property was well maintained, and that his responses were reasonable. Doubt began to creep into Margaret's carefully orchestrated narrative. Meanwhile, Nathan increased his intelligence gathering. Security cameras captured more than just the driveway. Audio recorders discreetly noted conversations in areas adjacent to his property. He hired a private investigator to monitor patterns around the HOA offices. Every action, every meeting, every whispered conversation was logged. Nathan knew that information, meticulously collected, could turn the tide. Margaret, frustrated by the slow erosion of her influence, decided to escalate further. She organized a special HOA meeting, inviting all neighbors to discuss the Nathan issue. Flyers were posted, emails sent, subtle threats implied. The agenda: discuss alleged violations, consider fines, and potentially vote on more restrictive rules targeting Nathan's property. Nathan received the notice calmly, reviewing every point in the agenda. He prepared counter-evidence, cross-checked bylaws, and outlined procedural errors the HOA was making. His strategy was meticulous. Attend, document, and expose. The day of the meeting arrived. The room was tense. Margaret presided with a sense of command, her voice steady, her posture confident. She opened with a formal statement, framing Nathan as a problem, a disruptor, someone who challenged the order of Willowbrook. Nathan stood, calm and composed, presenting his case with precision. Every accusation was countered with evidence. Photographs, timestamps, legal citations. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't attack personally. He simply exposed the inconsistencies and manipulations with facts. The board and neighbors watched. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, realizing for the first time that Margaret's narrative was flawed. Some whispered to one another, questioning the fairness of the process. Doubt was spreading like wildfire. Margaret's confidence faltered. Her attacks were precise, but Nathan's defense was surgical. She attempted a series of rapid-fire allegations, hoping to overwhelm him, but Nathan anticipated each one, countering methodically. The room's energy shifted. The storm was no longer looming. It was happening, and Nathan was at its center, unwavering. By the end of the meeting, the vote Margaret had hoped for never came. Instead, the board deferred decisions, citing the need for further review. Margaret left, seething but restrained. Nathan stayed, quietly organizing his documentation, aware that this was a victory, but not the war. Outside, the atmosphere was electric. Neighbors approached Nathan, some with questions, some with apologies, others simply with acknowledgement. He had begun to build a coalition, not of overt allies but of quiet witnesses, people who now understood that the HOA's power was not absolute, and that standing firm could change perceptions. That night, Nathan reviewed the footage from the meeting and his neighborhood cameras. Patterns emerged. Which neighbors were supportive, which were neutral, and which were aligned with Margaret. Each detail was noted, catalogued, and used to refine his strategy. Nathan wasn't just surviving. He was learning, adapting, and preparing for the next phase. Margaret, in her office, plotted her next move. She understood that subtle tactics were no longer sufficient. Nathan had proven resilient, strategic, and resourceful. She would need a more aggressive approach, something that would either break him or expose him publicly. But she underestimated one crucial factor: Nathan's resolve. He wasn't just defending his property. He was defending his principles. Each act of aggression, each subtle attempt to intimidate, strengthened his strategy. Nathan knew the rules, understood the law, and anticipated human behavior with precision. He had become a force the HOA could not ignore, a storm in its own right. The battle lines were now clearly drawn. It was no longer a simple dispute over property or bylaws. It was a war of influence, perception, and endurance. Nathan was not merely resisting. He was preparing to expose, counter, and ultimately reshape the power dynamics of Willowbrook. And somewhere in the shadows, Margaret's frustration grew, her patience waned. She was about to learn that storms, once fully unleashed, cannot be tamed or redirected. They must be endured, or they destroy everything in their path. Nathan closed his files, leaned back in his chair, and allowed himself a quiet smile. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, he sensed something important. He was no longer alone. Allies existed, evidence was mounting, and every move Margaret made only strengthened his position. Tomorrow, the real confrontation would begin. And when it did, Nathan would be ready not just to survive but to win. The morning dawned cold and gray over Willowbrook, a reflection of the tension gripping the neighborhood. Nathan surveyed his property, now armed with more evidence, allies, and a steely resolve. The air smelled faintly of frost, yet beneath it lingered the sense of something darker. An unseen pressure, a community on the edge of manipulation, and an HOA poised for escalation. Nathan's phone buzzed with a message from one of the neighbors who had remained neutral until now. "Meet me tonight. I have info about Margaret." He didn't hesitate. Every lead, every whisper, could be a turning point in this increasingly complex chess game. Margaret, on the other hand, was growing desperate. Her carefully cultivated power structure showed cracks. Nathan's methodical documentation, public meetings, and discreet alliances had begun to unravel the perception she had controlled for months. She knew subtle intimidation wouldn't suffice any longer. The stakes had risen, and she decided it was time to escalate. Sabotage in plain sight. The first act came early that day. Nathan noticed subtle changes. A faint chemical smell near the hedges, small cuts in wiring leading to his exterior lights, and strangely placed obstacles in the driveway. He realized it wasn't random. It was calculated harassment meant to unsettle him. Nathan documented everything, photographing, timing, and cross-referencing every anomaly with security footage. He even noticed faint footprints in the mud, barely visible yet telling. Someone had been here in the dead of night, deliberately testing his defenses. At the same time, the HOA began spreading targeted rumors. Nathan overheard neighbors talking, cautiously at first, then more boldly. Whispered warnings about trouble with the law and neighbors' complaints began circulating. Margaret had begun to weaponize social perception, using fear and misinformation to isolate him further. Nathan remained calm. He knew that reacting impulsively would play into Margaret's hands. Instead, he developed a multi-layered strategy. Security upgrades, legal counsel, and a careful social approach to reclaim the narrative. He installed motion-sensitive cameras with encrypted cloud storage, hired a legal advisor specializing in HOA disputes, and quietly met with sympathetic neighbors to gather testimonies. The night arrived. Nathan met the neighbor who had reached out. They spoke in hushed tones over coffee in the dimly lit kitchen of the neutral neighbor's home. "I've seen things," the neighbor whispered. Meetings Margaret held, private emails she sent, threats she made. "She's coordinating a push to force you out, maybe even legal action." Nathan listened intently, taking notes. Every piece of information mattered. "Do you have proof?" he asked. "I do," the neighbor said, pulling out a stack of printed emails, notes from meetings, and photographs. "This is her playbook. She's targeting you specifically, and the board is following her lead, quietly behind the scenes." Nathan felt a surge of clarity. The HOA was no longer acting as a neutral governing body. It had become an instrument of personal vendetta. Every rule, every letter, every subtle act of intimidation was now a weapon in Margaret's hands. Back at home, Nathan reviewed the materials meticulously. Patterns emerged. Dates of incidents, locations, actors involved, and methods used. He began constructing a timeline that would later serve as a central piece of evidence. This was no longer just a property dispute, it was a coordinated siege. The following days were a whirlwind. Nathan's property was targeted more aggressively. His mailbox was vandalized, security lights disabled, and garden statues defaced. The psychological pressure was immense, yet Nathan remained calm. He understood a fundamental truth. The more Margaret escalated, the stronger his case became. Nathan's legal advisor suggested filing formal complaints and preparing a lawsuit if necessary. He began drafting legal notices, citing specific violations of property rights, harassment, and intimidation. Meanwhile, Nathan leveraged social proof. Neighbors who had witnessed events began to speak up, subtly shifting the perception of the community. The turning point came when Margaret attempted her most audacious act yet. She organized a surprise inspection with multiple board members, claiming Nathan had ignored repeated violations. They arrived unannounced, clipboards in hand, ready to document evidence that didn't exist. Nathan, prepared and composed, met them calmly. He guided the inspectors around his property, pointing out compliant measurements, properly maintained gardens, and security footage proving the absence of infractions. The board members, visibly flustered, exchanged uneasy glances. Margaret's confident narrative faltered under the weight of facts. One board member whispered to another, "These violations, they're nothing." Another muttered, "This isn't right. Why are we even here?" Nathan observed silently, noting every reaction. When the inspection concluded, Nathan delivered a calm, powerful statement. "I've documented every interaction, every correspondence, and every accusation. If there are questions about compliance, the evidence is clear. I am happy to provide it to anyone who seeks the truth." Margaret's face tightened. Her attempt to intimidate had failed. She had underestimated Nathan's preparation, composure, and strategic thinking. The board left, less convinced of her authority and more aware of her overreach. Nathan's allies, some of whom had remained quiet until now, began to emerge more openly. Conversations in the neighborhood shifted. The narrative Margaret had tried to control now leaned in Nathan's favor. His meticulous records, calm demeanor, and discreet alliances had turned the tide of perception. But Nathan knew better than to celebrate prematurely. Margaret was relentless, and her next move would likely be more aggressive, more personal. He prepared for the escalation, anticipating psychological warfare, legal maneuvering, and public manipulation. Late at night, Nathan reviewed the timeline once again. Every act of sabotage, every rumor, every intimidation tactic was logged. He realized that this wasn't merely a battle over property. It was a test of endurance, strategy, and principle. Margaret had started the siege, but Nathan had begun to map it, understand it, and counter it. In the quiet of his office, Nathan allowed himself a brief, controlled smile. The HOA may have launched the siege, but he was no longer on the defensive. Every act against him only strengthened his position. Every intimidation created new allies, and every misstep Margaret made became ammunition in his arsenal. Tomorrow would bring confrontation, perhaps even direct threats or legal action. But Nathan was ready. The siege had begun, but so had his counterstrike. The storm, once dormant, was now awake, and Nathan was no longer merely surviving. He was preparing to dominate, to expose, and ultimately, to win. As the neighborhood slept, shadows moved in the periphery, plotting, waiting. But Nathan, awake, alert, and resolute, was already 2 steps ahead. The War of Willowbrook had entered a new phase, and this time, Nathan was orchestrating it. The morning light cut through Nathan's office windows, illuminating stacks of documents, photographs, and digital files meticulously organized. Today was the day he would take the HOA's siege into the legal arena. The escalation had been coming for weeks. Vandalism, intimidation, smear campaigns, and covert harassment. Nathan had waited, documented, and prepared. Now it was time to make every violation count. His legal advisor, a seasoned attorney named Claire, arrived promptly. She had reviewed every email, letter, and security footage Nathan had collected. "This is more than harassment," she said, scanning the materials. "This is a coordinated effort to force you out. If we present it properly, the board and Margaret won't just lose credibility. They could face liability." Nathan nodded. "That's the goal. They've been hiding behind rules, misleading neighbors, and trying to intimidate me. No more hiding. Let's make them accountable." The first step was filing a formal complaint with the HOA's governing authority and sending a detailed letter outlining specific violations: intimidation, harassment, falsified complaints, property sabotage, and misuse of board authority. Claire had drafted it carefully, citing previous legal precedents and clearly naming Margaret as the orchestrator. Nathan reviewed it once, then signed. The document would land in Margaret's hands today. While waiting for confirmation, Nathan contacted neighbors who had been silent until now. One by one, they came forward, sharing observations they had feared reporting. A pattern emerged. Not just Margaret, but a faction of the board had actively participated in her campaign, coordinating inspections and spreading rumors. Each testimony added weight, each account built a web of accountability. By mid-afternoon, the HOA received Nathan's formal notice. Margaret's reaction was immediate. Calls, frantic emails, and a personal visit to Nathan's home. She arrived with a forced smile, clipboard in hand, attempting to appear calm. "Nathan," she said, voice tight, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. Surely we can resolve this amicably." Nathan didn't rise to the bait. Calm, measured, he replied, "Margaret, I've documented every action, every threat, every manipulation. The HOA rules are clear and the law is clear. I am giving you the opportunity to rectify this before it escalates further." Her eyes flickered, a brief hint of panic. She had assumed he would be cowed, intimidated, or at least hesitant. Instead, Nathan's composure and preparation had stripped her of control. Over the next few days, tensions in Willowbrook shifted dramatically. Neighbors began questioning Margaret openly. Questions once whispered now echoed at HOA meetings. Why are inspections unannounced? Why are rules selectively enforced? Why was Nathan targeted specifically? The power she had wielded so confidently began to erode. Meanwhile, Nathan continued building his case. Every incident of vandalism, every falsified complaint, every intimidation tactic was logged chronologically. He paired photographs with time-stamped footage, emails with testimony, and letters with witness statements. It was a fortress of evidence designed not just to defend but to expose. The first major confrontation came in a formal HOA meeting. Nathan entered the boardroom, files in hand, confidence radiating. Margaret tried her usual tactics, smiles, subtle intimidation, and selective memory. But Nathan presented his documentation clearly, methodically, and without emotion. "Here are the facts," he said, placing photographs, emails, and witness statements on the table. "Every claim against me has been investigated, documented, and verified. Every action taken by the board against me has been selective, targeted, and unjust. The evidence speaks for itself." Board members exchanged uneasy glances. Margaret's composure faltered. She attempted to interject, but Claire, seated beside Nathan, calmly interrupted. "Let's focus on facts, not narratives," she said firmly. By the end of the meeting, the HOA board was forced to acknowledge discrepancies and halt any further enforcement against Nathan until an independent review could be conducted. It was a small victory, but a critical one. Margaret's control had been challenged, her authority questioned, and her tactics exposed to scrutiny. Word spread quickly. Neighborhood conversations shifted. Whispers of injustice transformed into discussions of accountability. Nathan's careful strategy of combining legal action, evidence documentation, and social influence had begun to reshape the community narrative. Margaret's allies, sensing the tide turning, grew hesitant, and some quietly distanced themselves from her. But Nathan knew the battle wasn't over. Margaret's next move could be more aggressive. Legal retaliation, public smears, or personal attacks designed to destabilize him. Preparation, vigilance, and foresight would be essential. Late that evening, Nathan reviewed his files again. The timeline of events stretched across months of careful observation, meticulous documentation, and courageous neighbor testimonies. He realized the true power of evidence. It didn't just defend. It revealed truth, dismantled deception, and restored balance. Nathan also reflected on his own growth. The siege had forced him to remain calm under pressure, think strategically, and leverage allies thoughtfully. He was no longer simply reacting. He was orchestrating a counterstrike, turning every challenge into an opportunity for accountability. As night fell over Willowbrook, Nathan felt a rare sense of calm. The legal battle had begun, and the first blows had landed. Margaret's carefully constructed world of manipulation and fear was starting to crumble, replaced by transparency, accountability, and truth. Tomorrow would bring another chapter of confrontation, likely more aggressive from Margaret, but Nathan was ready. Each move he made was measured, precise, and aimed at a single goal. Not just victory, but exposing the injustice for all to see. The siege had entered a new phase. It was no longer a battle of whispers and intimidation. It had become a legal and moral reckoning. And Nathan was prepared to see it through no matter the cost. The morning sun glinted off the glass facades of Willowbrook as Nathan drove to the courthouse. Today was the culmination of months of meticulous preparation. The independent review of the HOA's actions was set to begin, and the community and Margaret would finally confront the consequences of their choices. Nathan felt no triumph, only focus. He had come too far to let emotion cloud strategy. Inside the courthouse, a hushed tension filled the air. Margaret arrived shortly after, flanked by her most loyal allies, their expressions carefully neutral but betraying faint anxiety. The board's attorney, a polished professional with a reputation for intimidating homeowners, greeted Nathan with a polite nod, aware that this case would test their tactics like never before. Claire guided Nathan to his seat, whispering, "Stick to facts. Emotional arguments will play into their hands. Evidence first, narrative second." Nathan nodded. The hearing began with the HOA's attorney presenting their case, a thinly veiled attempt to discredit Nathan, painting him as a difficult neighbor exaggerating minor grievances. Margaret attempted to speak, her voice steady but brittle. "Nathan has misinterpreted our actions," she said. "He's turning routine procedures into personal attacks." Claire rose calmly. "With your permission, Your Honor, I would like to present the chronological evidence of harassment and misconduct by the board and its affiliates, specifically directed at Nathan. This includes photographs, emails, security footage, and verified witness testimonies. The judge nodded, intrigued. Nathan watched as Claire laid out each incident clearly and methodically. Falsified complaints. Emails submitted to the HOA alleging violations Nathan never committed, each disproven by timestamps, neighbors' testimonies, and photographic evidence. Vandalism and intimidation. Security footage showed repeated tampering with Nathan's property, suspicious personnel entering his property during inspections, and notes left threatening consequences. Selective enforcement. Records demonstrated that other homeowners violating the same rules faced no repercussions, highlighting targeted harassment. Community pressure. Internal HOA communications revealed plans to manipulate neighbor opinions and orchestrate coordinated complaints against Nathan. As each point was presented, Margaret's composure frayed. A slip of anger here, a nervous glance there. Nathan noted it carefully. Her carefully cultivated image of control was cracking in real time. Neighbors who had previously remained silent were called to testify. Their voices, once tentative, grew stronger as they recounted the intimidation they had witnessed, the unusual scrutiny Nathan had endured, and the subtle manipulations Margaret had orchestrated. A clear pattern emerged. This was not a series of isolated events, but a coordinated campaign of coercion and fear. By mid-afternoon, the courtroom atmosphere had shifted. Murmurs filled the room as board members exchanged uneasy glances. The weight of the evidence was undeniable. Margaret attempted a final defense, claiming her actions were routine and misunderstood. But her words fell flat against the detailed record laid before the judge. Nathan, sitting quietly, felt a mix of vindication and relief. Months of documenting, collecting testimonies, and preparing legal strategies had brought him to this moment. He didn't need to speak, his evidence did all the talking. The judge, after reviewing the material and hearing testimonies, delivered a firm statement. The evidence presented demonstrates a systematic pattern of harassment and selective enforcement. The HOA board is hereby ordered to cease all actions against Nathan immediately, and a formal review of Margaret's conduct will be conducted with possible consequences, including removal from the board. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Margaret's face turned pale, her carefully maintained authority evaporating. Nathan felt a quiet satisfaction, not in revenge, but in justice. Outside the courthouse, news of the verdict spread quickly through Willowbrook. The community, which had previously whispered about Nathan in cautious tones, now approached him openly, offering support and apologies. For the first time, he saw the full impact of truth confronting fear. Margaret's influence in the community began to collapse rapidly. Loyal allies distanced themselves, not wanting to be associated with a tarnished reputation. The HOA board, previously operating with near-absolute power, was forced into transparency, with external auditors and legal oversight ensuring accountability. But the fallout didn't stop there. Investigative journalists, tipped off by Nathan's meticulous documentation, began reporting on the case. Headlines highlighted the abuse of HOA power, manipulation of community members, and targeted harassment. Margaret became a cautionary tale, her network of influence exposed publicly. Nathan knew the journey wasn't just about him anymore. His struggle had become a lesson in accountability, transparency, and the importance of standing firm against abuse. He had transformed a personal siege into a community reckoning, shining a light on hidden injustices. That evening, Nathan walked through his property, the calm after the storm settling over Willowbrook. Neighbors waved, children played, and for the first time in months he felt safe. But more than that, he felt empowered. He had confronted systemic injustice, leveraged evidence, and catalyzed change. Not just for himself, but for everyone affected by Margaret's network. Claire joined him on the porch. "You did more than defend yourself," she said. "You exposed the truth, and you changed this community." Nathan nodded, his gaze steady. It wasn't easy, and it's not over for everyone involved. But justice, even when delayed, is worth the effort. As night fell, Willowbrook's skyline reflected a quiet triumph. Margaret's reign of intimidation had ended, replaced by accountability and transparency. Nathan's journey, once solitary and fraught with uncertainty, had become a blueprint for resilience, strategy, and moral courage. The final chapter would reveal the aftermath. how the community rebuilt trust, the consequences Margaret faced, and Nathan's ongoing mission to ensure that power is never abused in silence again. The morning after the verdict, Willowbrook was quiet but different. The usual hum of complaints and HOA directives was absent, replaced by tentative conversations among neighbors who had previously avoided each other, or Nathan, out of fear. News of the court decision had spread overnight, leaving a mix of relief, curiosity, and cautious optimism in its wake. Nathan walked through his neighborhood, greeting familiar faces. Some offered shy smiles, others whispered thanks for standing up to the board. It was surreal. He had spent months as a target, yet now people sought him out as a symbol of fairness and courage. Yet he remained grounded. He knew this was only the beginning of restoring trust and balance in Willowbrook. Inside his house, Nathan reviewed the court documents once more. Each piece of evidence, each testimony, and the judge's ruling felt like a shield against past fears. Claire entered, carrying a folder of updates from the HOA and the media coverage that had begun to trickle in. "The board is in disarray," she said. "Several members resigned overnight. Margaret is contesting the ruling, but her options are limited, especially with public scrutiny mounting. External auditors will oversee HOA actions moving forward, ensuring transparency." Nathan nodded, feeling a cautious satisfaction. "Good. But what about the community? This isn't just about removing Margaret. People need to rebuild trust with the HOA and with each other." Claire flipped through the folder. "That's happening too. Many neighbors want open meetings, committees to address grievances, and a platform for everyone to speak without fear. Some even reached out to you directly for guidance." Nathan thought about how isolated he had felt when the harassment began. He remembered the late nights documenting emails, security footage, and neighbor testimonies. That painstaking work had changed the course of Willowbrook, but it also came with a responsibility to ensure the community didn't revert to secrecy and fear. He called a neighborhood meeting at the community hall. Attendance exceeded expectations. The hall was packed with residents eager to speak. Nathan, standing before them, kept his words clear and concise. "Today isn't about one person's victory," he said. "It's about fairness, transparency, and the idea that no one should live in fear in their own home. We've seen what unchecked power can do. Our next steps must ensure accountability, communication, and mutual respect. This is a chance to rebuild Willowbrook as a community, not a battleground." Voices rose, questions were asked, and ideas flowed. Residents proposed monthly open meetings, an anonymous complaint system to prevent misuse, and an advisory board that included non-HOA members. Nathan encouraged collaboration, mediating conflicts and offering guidance where needed. Slowly, a culture of openness began to emerge. Meanwhile, Margaret faced consequences beyond the courtroom. News outlets highlighted her actions, emphasizing the abuse of authority and targeted harassment. Public opinion was harsh. Former allies distanced themselves, wary of being associated with her tarnished reputation. The internal review by the auditors confirmed irregularities in board procedures, leaving Margaret with limited options: formal reprimand, potential removal, and reputational damage. Nathan, however, refrained from celebrating personal vindication. His focus remained on ensuring a sustainable, positive change for Willowbrook. He worked closely with the remaining board members, residents, and auditors to implement reforms. Policies were rewritten, enforcement procedures clarified, and community oversight committees formed. Transparency became the new standard. In the weeks that followed, life in Willowbrook began to normalize. The tension that had permeated the neighborhood lifted, replaced by cautious optimism and renewed neighborly connections. Nathan observed the changes quietly, noting that real transformation required time, patience, and continued vigilance. One evening, as he walked along the lakefront, he saw families enjoying the water, children laughing, and neighbors chatting freely. The serenity was a stark contrast to the fear and hostility that had defined the past year. Nathan realized that while justice had been served in court, the real victory was in restoring trust, community, and a sense of security for everyone. Claire joined him at the lake, handing him a cup of coffee. "You've done more than most could imagine," she said. "You've turned a personal battle into a community triumph." Nathan smiled faintly. "It wasn't just me. People needed courage to speak, and evidence to back their voices. We just helped make it visible. The challenge now is keeping Willowbrook accountable, even when the spotlight fades. As night settled over the neighborhood, the water reflected shimmering lights from nearby homes. Nathan felt a sense of quiet fulfillment. The battle against misuse of power, intimidation, and fear had left scars, but it had also catalyzed growth, awareness, and a stronger, more united community. Over the next months, Willowbrook continued to evolve. Monthly community meetings became a norm, residents collaborated on projects, and the HOA adapted to a new, more transparent structure. Margaret's influence waned entirely. Attempts to regain control were met with scrutiny and resistance. The neighborhood had learned to guard against the unchecked authority that had once caused so much harm. Nathan's journey had transformed him as well. He learned that courage, meticulous planning, and the willingness to face opposition could effect lasting change. More importantly, he understood that true justice extended beyond personal victory. It was about empowering others and safeguarding the community from future abuse. In the end, Willowbrook's story became a case study in resilience, accountability, and the power of standing up to systemic injustice. Nathan's fight had exposed flaws, corrected wrongs, and most importantly, reminded everyone that courage, evidence, and persistence could dismantle even the most entrenched abuses of power. And as he watched the community thrive under a new era of transparency, Nathan realized that the journey, though arduous, had been worth every step.